The cold, synthetic light of the hospital room hummed a monotonous tune, a sound that had become the soundtrack to Arthur's last 3 days. It was a sterile world of beeping machines and the faint, ever-present scent of antiseptic, a world that had held him suspended between a failing past and an uncertain future. Now the machines were silent. The 4-drip had been removed, leaving a small, bruised purple flower on the back of his weathered hand. He was cleared to go home. Home. The word felt foreign, a distant shore he could see but wasn't sure he could reach. He sat on the edge of the crisp, white bed, his feet not quite touching the polished linoleum floor. In his hand, a small, cracked smartphone felt heavier than it should. A slab of glass and metal that had just delivered a verdict colder than any doctor's diagnosis. He had written a simple message into the family chat group, a group named Vance Family Fun, with a cheerful, ironic sun emoji. The message was humble, a request, not a demand. Surgery went well. The doctor is discharging me this morning. Who can pick me up from the hospital? He had typed it slowly, his thumb clumsy and thick, his heart, the very organ that had been so recently and violently repaired, thumping with a fragile, foolish hope. He had imagined his son Mark's face, perhaps a little tired from work, but smiling. He had imagined Jessica, his daughter-in-law, telling him they'd be there soon to just sit tight. The response had come almost instantly. From Mark, 6 words that landed like 6 shards of ice in his chest. Call a taxi. I'm watching TV. There was no punctuation, no kindness, just the stark, brutal efficiency of a man swatting away a fly. Before Arthur could even process the sting, a second message appeared, a bubbly notification from Jessica. OMG, Mark's right. And besides, stay in the hospital for another month. It's so nice and quiet without you. LOL. The LOL was the cruelest part. A little digital laugh track playing over his humiliation. He stared at the screen, the bright, cheerful colors of the chat interface mocking the gray despair that was seeping into the room. To them, he was just an old man, a burden, a disruption to their television schedule. He was a chore to be outsourced to a taxi. He was a punchline. He was nothing. This is the moment where the story truly begins. Not in the operating theater under the searing lights, but here, in the quiet, humming silence of a lonely hospital room. Welcome to our channel. If you believe that true strength is often found in the quietest souls and that honor is something you carry inside you, not something you wear on your sleeve, then we hope you'll join our community by subscribing and ringing that bell, because every story we tell is a testament to the unseen heroes who walk among us. Arthur slowly locked the phone, the screen going dark, but the words remained, burned onto the back of his eyelids. He didn't sigh. He didn't curse. He didn't feel the hot flush of anger or the cold wave of self-pity. Instead, a familiar, heavy cloak of resignation settled over his shoulders. It was a garment he had worn many times before, tailored by years of quiet endurance. He was a man who had learned to expect nothing, and so was rarely disappointed, only saddened. The quiet heroism of his life had been to simply continue, to put one foot in front of the other, especially when no one was watching. And no one was ever watching. He looked at his hands, at the network of scars and calluses that mapped a life of hard work and harder sacrifice. They were not the hands of a man who watched television. They were the hands of a man who had built, who had fixed, who had held on when everything was trying to tear him away. They were the hands that had once held his infant son, Mark, so gently, so fiercely, promising to build a world for him that was safe and warm. He had kept that promise. He had worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. He had sacrificed his own dreams so that Mark could have every opportunity, every advantage. He had paid for the college education that led to the good job, which led to the nice house, which led to the comfortable couch where his son now sat, too absorbed in a flickering screen to fetch his own father from the hospital. The irony was a dull, aching throb, a rhythm that matched the new, metallic beat in his chest where the doctors had patched him up. They could fix the muscle and the valves, but they couldn't mend the deeper, more painful wounds that family could inflict. He stood up slowly, his body stiff, a map of aches and pains. He reached for the simple plastic bag on the bedside table containing his belongings. A worn pair of gray trousers, a faded blue button-down shirt, and a threadbare wool coat that had seen at least 15 winters too many. This was his uniform now, the armor of anonymity. As he dressed, he moved with a deliberate, practiced economy of motion, a discipline that seemed out of place with his civilian clothes and the slight tremble in his hands. He was just an old man. That's what they saw. That's what they believed. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that this quiet, forgotten father had once been a man who nations sent into the dark to face monsters. A man whose silence had been a shield for kings and presidents. They didn't know that the hands they dismissed as old and weak had once disarmed bombs that could level city blocks and had pulled survivors from the twisted wreckage of fallen empires. They had no idea who he was. And that, he thought, as he buttoned his thin shirt against the coming chill, was the entire point. He had chosen this life of quiet obscurity. He had traded glory for peace, recognition for normalcy. He had wanted nothing more than to be a father, a grandfather, to fade into the gentle twilight of a life well lived. He just never imagined the twilight would be this lonely or this cold. The small, one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a walk-up building was a testament to a life lived with intention and without excess. It was Arthur's sanctuary, a fortress of solitude built not of stone, but of neatly stacked books, polished wood, and quiet memories. There were no medals displayed on the walls, no framed commendations hanging over the mantelpiece. The only awards were the faint, silvered stretch marks on the bindings of his favorite novels and the honorable discharge of a life that had asked for very little in return for all it had given. His days followed a simple, predictable rhythm. He would wake before the sun, the ingrained discipline of a former life refusing to let him sleep in. He would perform a series of slow, deliberate stretches, his body a roadmap of old injuries that ached in protest against the morning damp. Then, coffee. Black, no sugar. He would sit in his worn leather armchair, a relic from a forgotten estate sale, and read until the city outside came to life. He read history, philosophy, poetry, anything that could transport him from the confines of his small rooms. He never read spy thrillers or war novels. He had no need for fictionalized accounts of a world he knew all too well. His son, Mark, and his wife, Jessica, lived in a different universe, one just 20 miles away but separated by a chasm of values. Their house was a modern marvel of glass and steel, a minimalist palace filled with the latest technology and designer furniture. It was a house designed to be looked at, not lived in, a showroom for their success. They saw Arthur's humble apartment as an embarrassment, a reflection of his failure to keep up with the times. They didn't understand his rejection of materialism, misinterpreting his contentment as a lack of ambition. "Dad, why don't you get a new TV?" Mark would ask, gesturing at the small, outdated set in the corner of Arthur's living room. "This thing is ancient." Arthur would just shrug. "It works." To Mark and Jessica, things that merely worked were insufficient. Things had to be new, smart, top of the line. Their lives were a curated collection of status symbols, and their father, in his worn coat and scuffed shoes, did not fit the aesthetic. He was a piece of their past they would rather keep in storage. They tolerated his presence at holidays, seating him at the far end of the table where his quiet dignity wouldn't clash with their loud, performative happiness. Their conversations with him were brief and superficial, a checklist of filial duty. "How are you feeling, Dad? Need anything? Okay, good." They never waited for the real answers. They didn't want to hear about his loneliness, his failing health, or the memories that sometimes haunted him in the dead of night. They wanted him to be a simple, uncomplicated problem they could solve with a quick phone call or a gift card for Christmas. Anything more was an inconvenience. During his stay in the hospital, a young nurse named Chloe had been assigned to his floor. She was barely in her 20s, with kind eyes and a gentle efficiency that reminded Arthur of someone he had known a long, long time ago. Unlike the others who bustled in and out, treating him as just another chart to be updated, Chloe took a moment to see the man in the bed. She noticed things. She noticed how he never complained, not even when the pain was obviously intense. She noticed how he kept his small corner of the room meticulously neat, his book and glasses placed just so on the bedside table. She noticed the way he watched everything, his eyes, a pale, faded blue, missing nothing. They weren't the vacant eyes of a sick old man. They were the observant, analytical eyes of a watchman on a wall. He was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were precise, stripped of all unnecessary emotion. He was polite, always thanking her. But there was an unbreachable wall around him, a profound stillness that was both calming and unnerving. She felt as though she were in the presence of something ancient and powerful, like an old, dormant volcano. She was the one who helped him with his discharge paperwork, her cheerful chatter filling the silence he left in the room. "All right, Mr. Vance, just a few signatures here and we can get you sprung from this place," she'd said, smiling. As she leaned over to hand him the pen, the loose sleeve of his hospital gown slid up his forearm, revealing a glimpse of something she hadn't seen before. It was a tattoo, but not like any she had ever seen. It was old. The ink faded to a blurry sea-green gray, but the design was distinct. It was a raven, its wings stylized and geometric, clutching an ornate, skeletal key in its talons. It was stark, elegant, and vaguely unsettling. "That's an interesting tattoo," she commented, her curiosity piqued. "Never seen one like it." Arthur pulled the sleeve down, a reflexive, almost unconscious movement. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the paperwork. "A reminder," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. A gentle closing of a door she hadn't realized she'd been trying to open. She didn't press. She knew a dead end when she saw one. But the image of the raven and the key stayed with her, a strange symbol for a quiet, unassuming old man. She helped him into his worn wool coat, feeling the frailness of his frame beneath the thin fabric. "Are you sure you don't want me to call a car service for you, Mr. Vance?" she asked, a knot of concern tightening in her stomach. "The hospital has an account. It's no trouble." He shook his head, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. It didn't quite reach his eyes. "The bus is fine. I enjoy the walk." He was lying, she knew it. No one enjoyed a walk to the bus stop in the biting November wind after major heart surgery. She watched him leave, his back straight, his steps slow but steady. He was a man adrift, cast off by a family that didn't deserve him, heading out into a world that had long since forgotten him. She stood at the window for a long time, watching his small, solitary figure recede down the busy street until it was swallowed by the indifferent crowd. The image of the raven with the key burned in her mind. A reminder of what? She wondered. A reminder of a promise? A debt? Or a reminder of a life that no one, not even his own son, knew he had lived? The decision to leave was not born of anger or defiance. For Arthur, it was simply the next logical step in a life defined by self-reliance. He had never been a man to wait for a rescue that wasn't coming. He understood, with a clarity that was both painful and liberating, that he was on his own. The doctor, a well-meaning man with tired eyes and a clipboard full of warnings, had advised against it. "Mr. Vance, your heart is stable, but it's still in a fragile state. You've just undergone a significant trauma. You need to rest. Let your son pick you up. Avoid any unnecessary strain." Arthur had simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand, doctor. Thank you." He had no intention of explaining the terse, dismissive text messages from his son. He would not air his family's dirty laundry to a stranger. His shame was a private, personal burden, and he would carry it, as he had carried everything else, in silence. The nurse, Chloe, had watched the exchange, her brow furrowed with a concern that felt more genuine than the doctor's professional platitudes. She was the one who handed him the plastic bag with his worn clothes. As he changed behind the thin curtain, she could hear the soft, rhythmic sounds of his movements, a quiet efficiency that spoke of long-practiced discipline. When he emerged, he was no longer a patient in a gown, but a man, diminished by illness but still possessing an unshakable core of dignity. He looked smaller in his street clothes, the old wool coat hanging loosely on his frame. Yet, his presence seemed to fill the room more than it had before. He was a man taking back control, however small, of his own destiny. It was during this final check that Chloe saw the tattoo again. As he reached for the discharge papers on the bedside table, his shirt cuff pulled back, revealing the faded ink on his forearm. The stylized raven. The skeletal key. This time she saw it more clearly. It wasn't a crude, amateur design. The lines were too clean, too precise, even after all these years. It was a symbol, a crest. It meant something. A reminder, he had said. The word echoed in her mind. He signed the papers with a steady hand, the name Arthur Vance flowing from the pen in a surprisingly elegant script. He folded the documents neatly and tucked them into the inner pocket of his coat. He then turned to Chloe and met her gaze directly for the first time. His eyes were a startlingly clear blue, like a winter sky, and for a fleeting moment, she felt a profound sense of being seen, of being assessed and understood in a way that was both unnerving and deeply comforting. "Thank you for your kindness, Chloe," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was a simple, formal statement, yet it carried the weight of absolute sincerity. "It's my job, Mr. Vance," she replied, her voice a little shaky. "Please, take care of yourself." He gave a single, curt nod, a gesture of finality. Then he turned and walked out of the room without a backward glance. The walk from the hospital's main entrance to the bus stop was only a few blocks, but for Arthur, it felt like a pilgrimage. Each step was a negotiation between his willpower and his protesting body. The November air was sharp and damp, biting at his cheeks and finding its way through the thin fabric of his coat. The city was a chaotic symphony of sounds. The roar of traffic, the distant wail of a siren, the cacophony of 1,000 conversations he wasn't a part of. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were a ghost observing a world that could no longer see him. The rhythmic thumping in his chest was a constant reminder of his own fragility. He could feel the delicate lattice of sutures and wires holding him together, a fragile piece of engineering against the chaos of the world. He clutched the cold metal of a lamppost for a moment, catching his breath, the city lights blurring into a watercolor smear before his eyes. He thought of Mark, sitting on his comfortable sofa, bathed in the blue light of a television screen, utterly oblivious. A wave of sorrow, so deep and vast it almost brought him to his knees, washed over him. It wasn't for himself. It was for his son. He had raised a boy who had mistaken comfort for happiness, convenience for love. He had given his son a life so free of hardship that he had no understanding of sacrifice, no capacity for empathy. In his effort to be a perfect provider, Arthur wondered if he had failed as a father. He had taught his son how to succeed, but he had forgotten to teach him how to care. The thought was more painful than the incision in his chest. He pushed himself off the lamppost and continued his slow, steady march toward the bus stop, his face a mask of stoic resolve. He was a soldier on one last mission, to get home. The bus arrived with a hydraulic hiss, its brakes groaning in protest. It was crowded, a microcosm of the city's weary, huddled masses, each person locked in their own private world of thoughts and worries. Arthur climbed the steps slowly, his hand gripping the railing, and paid his fare with a handful of loose change he had carefully counted out. He found a single seat by a window smeared with the grime of 1,000 journeys. As the bus lurched back into the flow of traffic, he watched the city slide by, a parade of anonymous faces and concrete canyons. He was invisible here, just another old man on a bus, his extraordinary past and his present pain completely hidden from view. There was a strange comfort in this anonymity. Here he was not a disappointment or a burden. He was simply a passenger, moving from one point to another. He leaned his head against the cool glass of the window, the vibrations of the engine a soothing, monotonous hum. The faces inside the bus were a study in human emotion. A young woman texting furiously, a smile playing on her lips, a construction worker in muddy boots, fast asleep, his head lolling with the motion of the bus, a mother trying to soothe a crying child. They were all living their stories, complex, beautiful, and messy, and he was just a footnote in their afternoon. The journey was slow, the bus stopping and starting in the relentless afternoon traffic. Back in their pristine suburban home, Mark and Jessica were having an argument. It was a low-stakes, familiar squabble about what to have for dinner. Jessica wanted to order Thai food. Mark felt like pizza. Their voices filled the cavernous, open-plan living room, bouncing off the polished concrete floors and the minimalist white walls. "I just don't feel like pizza, Mark," Jessica whined, scrolling through a food delivery app on her phone. "We had it twice last week." "So? It's good," Mark said, his eyes glued to the sports channel on their massive, wall-mounted television. "And I'm not in the mood for all those weird spices." The conversation was a perfect encapsulation of their lives. A gentle friction between two people who had so much, they had to invent problems to solve. In the middle of their debate, Jessica's phone buzzed. It was a reminder from her calendar. "Call Dad post-surgery." She sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of annoyance. "Oh God, we should probably call your dad," she said, her tone making it clear she considered it a deeply unpleasant chore. Mark grunted, not taking his eyes off the screen. "He's fine," he texted. "Remember? Said he was getting out today." "I know, but we should at least check in. It's the right thing to do." Her concept of the right thing was a performance, a box to be checked so she could feel good about herself. "Fine, you call him," Mark said, waving a dismissive hand. "I'm watching the game." Jessica's face tightened. "Why do I always have to be the one to do it? He's your father. And he likes you more," Mark countered, a lazy, unconvincing lie. "Just get it over with." The argument shifted, the topic of dinner forgotten, replaced by the more pressing issue of whose responsibility it was to perform the 5-minute task of feigning concern for the man who gave them everything. They were so absorbed in their petty squabble, in the comfortable, insulated bubble of their own creation, that they were completely oblivious to the real drama unfolding just a few miles away. The bus had come to a complete stop. Up ahead, a sea of red taillights stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was filled with the sound of distant sirens, a frantic, rising and falling wail that signaled a crisis. People on the bus were stirring, craning their necks to see what was happening. A nervous energy began to ripple through the passengers. Arthur sat up, his posture subtly changing. The weary passenger was gone, replaced by something else, something more alert. His gaze sharpened, and he scanned the scene outside, his mind automatically processing information, assessing the situation with a calm, practiced efficiency. Police cars were angled across the road, creating a makeshift blockade. Officers were waving cars off the main thoroughfare, their movements tense and urgent. The traffic jam was a symptom. Arthur looked past the blockade, toward the Jefferson Bridge that spanned the river a quarter of a mile ahead. It was there, the source of the chaos. Even from this distance, he could see it. A small, solitary figure, standing on the wrong side of the railing. The sight sent a jolt through him, a current of cold, professional recognition. He had seen this scene before in different cities, in different languages, but the grammar of despair was universal. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his journey home was about to be delayed. The atmosphere on the bus had shifted from weary boredom to anxious excitement. Passengers pressed their faces against the windows, their phones held up to capture the distant drama unfolding on the bridge. Their murmurs filled the space, a chorus of speculation and morbid curiosity. "What's going on? Is that someone on the bridge? Oh my God. I think he's going to jump." The words hung in the air, a mix of horror and titillation. For the people on the bus, this was a spectacle, a shocking interruption to their mundane afternoon, a story they would tell their friends and family later that evening. For Arthur, it was something else entirely. It was a problem to be solved, a life to be saved. The old instincts, dormant for so long, began to stir within him. It was a feeling he recognized, a low thrum of hyper-awareness that had once been his constant companion. The world seemed to slow down, to sharpen. He wasn't seeing a potential tragedy. He was analyzing a tactical situation. He noted the direction of the wind, the position of the sun which would be in the eyes of anyone approaching from the west. He saw the cluster of police cars and the ambulance parked at the base of the bridge, a standard but flawed staging area. They were too close, their presence a form of pressure, a crowd that could spook the man on the ledge into making an irreversible decision. He could see the body language of the distant figure, the way he was balanced, the tension in his shoulders. This was not a performance. This was a man who had reached the end of his rope. Arthur's mind, a tool honed by decades of operating in the most extreme environments, began to work, sifting through possibilities, calculating risks, formulating strategies. He had been trained to see the world as a series of interlocking systems, and he could see precisely where this system was failing. The first responders, though well-intentioned, were making critical errors. They were treating it as a negotiation, a battle of wills. He knew it was not about winning an argument. It was about offering a connection, a single, slender thread for a drowning man to grasp. The pain in his chest, the weariness in his bones. It all faded into the background, replaced by a singular, crystalline focus. A lifetime ago, he had made a promise to himself, a private vow made in the smoking ruins of a failed mission. He would never again stand by and do nothing while a life was on the line. He had retired from the job, but he had never retired from the promise. He stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, but it carried an undeniable sense of purpose. A few nearby passengers glanced at him, their faces a mixture of curiosity and annoyance at the old man blocking their view. He ignored them. He walked to the front of the bus, his hand steady on the overhead rail. The bus driver, a portly man with a face etched with stress, looked up at him. "Sorry, folks. Looks like we're not going anywhere for a while. Roads completely blocked." "I need to get off," Arthur said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the bus. The driver shook his head. "Can't do that, pal. We're in the middle of the highway. Regulations." Arthur looked the driver in the eye. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply held the man's gaze, and in the depths of his pale blue eyes, the driver saw something that made him swallow hard. It was an authority that had nothing to do with uniforms or badges, a profound and unshakable certainty that was more compelling than any rulebook. "Open the door," Arthur said again. It was not a request. The driver's hand moved, almost against his will, and hit the button. With a pneumatic hiss, the doors folded open, revealing the chaotic scene outside. The sirens were louder now, a frantic, piercing shriek. Arthur stepped off the bus and onto the cold pavement of the highway. The wind whipped at his thin coat, but he seemed not to notice. He stood for a moment, a solitary, unassuming figure silhouetted against the flashing red and blue lights, and took a deep breath. The air tasted of gasoline and fear. He had a job to do. The long walk home had just become a mission. He began to move towards the police line, his limp more pronounced now, each step a small victory of mind over matter. He was no longer just Arthur Vance, the forgotten father. He was a man walking back into a world he had left behind, a ghost returning to the land of the living. The police cordon was a chaotic jumble of uniformed officers, yellow tape, and flashing lights. It was a wall of authority designed to keep the public out and the crisis contained. A young patrolman, puffed up with the self-importance of his new uniform, stepped forward to block Arthur's path. His hand rested on his hip, his stance wide and confrontational. "Whoa there, Grandpa. You can't go any further. This is a restricted area. Turn around and go back to the bus." The officer's voice was loud, condescending, a lazy assertion of power over a man he had already judged and dismissed. He saw a frail, confused old man who had wandered away from the other spectators. He didn't see the lifetime of experience that was calmly assessing his posture, his tone, his tactical position. He didn't see the man who had trained people like him. Arthur stopped. He didn't react to the grandpa insult. He didn't try to argue. His gaze went past the young officer, focusing on the chaos beyond the tape. "I can help," he said, his voice quiet, almost carried away by the wind. The officer laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Help? Okay, Rambo, we've got this under control. I'm gonna need you to move along, sir. Now. He put a hand on Arthur's shoulder to guide him away. It was a mistake. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't resist. He simply shifted his weight, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, and the officer's hand found itself holding nothing but air. The officer blinked, confused. He hadn't been shoved or pushed, yet he had lost his purchase. It was like trying to grab smoke. Arthur took another step forward, his eyes still locked on the bridge. Your lead negotiator is approaching from the man's dominant side. He's carrying a radio. The static will sound like a weapon to a paranoid subject. You've allowed the media to set up a direct line of sight. He feels like he's on a stage. You're not de-escalating. You're cornering him. Each sentence was delivered in a flat, analytical monotone. It wasn't a criticism. It was a diagnosis. The young officer stared at him, his smug certainty beginning to waver. Where was this old man getting this from? He opened his mouth to deliver another command, but the words died in his throat. Arthur had already moved past him, slipping under the yellow tape with a fluid grace that belied his age and his limp. He moved with a sense of purpose that was so absolute, no one thought to stop him. He walked directly toward the command post. A small cluster of senior officers huddled around the back of a patrol car. The man in charge was a detective, his face a mask of stress and exhaustion. He was speaking into a headset, his voice tight with frustration. Just keep talking to him, Dave. Build a rapport. What does he want? Arthur stopped a few feet away from the detective. He waited patiently, his stillness a stark contrast to the frantic energy around him. The detective finally finished his call and turned, his eyes landing on Arthur with raw irritation. Who the hell are you? This is a secure scene. Get him out of here, he barked at a nearby officer. Arthur didn't wait for the escort. He spoke directly to the detective, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the storm. You're crowding him, he said, echoing the words he'd spoken to the patrolman. He doesn't need an audience. He needs an anchor. The detective's face flushed with anger. And who are you? Dr. Phil? We're a little busy here, in case you hadn't noticed. We're following protocol. Your protocol is failing, Arthur stated simply. There was no judgment in his voice, only fact. The man on that ledge isn't looking for a deal. He's looking for a reason. You can't give him one by shouting at him through a bullhorn. Desperation was a powerful acid. It could dissolve even the most. Rigid certainty. The detective looked from Arthur's calm, knowing face to the desperate, lonely figure on the bridge. He had been on this scene for 2 hours. His negotiator was making no progress. The man was getting more agitated. The protocol was, in fact, failing. Something in Arthur's demeanor, a profound and unnerving competence, a complete lack of fear, registered with the detective. This was not a crank. This was not a rubbernecker. He didn't know what this man was, but in a situation with no good options left, a strange one suddenly seemed worth considering. What would you do? The detective asked, the words tasting like surrender. Let me walk out there, Arthur said. Alone. No radio. No bullhorn. No backup. Just me. The detective stared at him as if he had grown a second head. Are you crazy? I can't let a civilian walk into a situation like this. The liability, Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping to an almost whisper, is that in 10 minutes he's going to get tired, the wind is going to gust, and you're going to be filling out a different kind of report. Let me talk to him. For a long, silent moment, the two men stood locked in a battle of wills. It was a contest between the rulebook and instinct, between protocol and a gut feeling. The detective looked into Arthur's pale blue eyes and saw a depth of experience that he couldn't begin to quantify. He made a decision that would either end his career or save a life. Go, he said, his voice barely audible over the sirens. You have 5 minutes. Arthur walked past the last police car and onto the long, exposed expanse of the bridge. The wind was stronger here, a physical force that pushed against him, whipping his thin coat around his legs. The noise of the highway fell away behind him, replaced by the mournful cry of the wind and the distant lap of water against the bridge's massive pylons. He was entering a different world now, a liminal space between life and death. He kept his pace slow and steady, his hands visible at his sides. He did not look directly at the man on the ledge, instead focusing on a point on the railing a few yards away from him. His training had taught him that a direct approach was an act of aggression. He needed to be a non-threat, a piece of the landscape. The man on the ledge, a young man in a thin hoodie, flinched as Arthur approached. "Stay back!" he screamed, his voice raw and ragged. "Don't come any closer or I'll jump." Arthur stopped. He was still a good 20 feet away. He didn't raise his hands in a placating gesture. He didn't shout back assurances. He simply stood there, a quiet, solid presence against the gray sky. He waited. A full minute passed. It was a contest of silence, and Arthur was a master. He let the young man's panic burn itself out, let the adrenaline recede. Finally, Arthur spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and calm, and the wind seemed to carry it directly to the man. "My name is Arthur," he said. "It's cold out here." He wasn't talking about the weather. The young man stared at him, his body trembling. "What do you want?" "Nothing," Arthur replied. "Just getting some air. My son told me to take a taxi." The statement was so strange, so out of place, that it broke the script the young man had been playing in his head. It wasn't the voice of a cop or a therapist. It was the voice of a tired old man. "What are you talking about?" the young man asked, his voice losing some of its frantic edge. "I just had heart surgery," Arthur said, his gaze still fixed on the railing. "Came out this morning. Family chat. My son's watching television. His wife says it's nice and quiet without me." He spoke the words without a trace of self-pity, just a flat recitation of facts. He was offering a piece of his own pain, creating a bridge of shared humanity. "So I'm walking home. It's a long walk." He finally turned his head and looked at the young man. He didn't offer a smile or a comforting phrase. He just looked at him, man to man, and in his eyes, the young man saw not judgment or pity, but a profound, weary understanding. He saw his own despair reflected in the eyes of this stranger. It was a connection, a single thread. The cameras, positioned a safe distance away, zoomed in, broadcasting the strange, quiet encounter live to the entire city. In her nurse's station, Chloe watched the hospital cafeteria TV, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mr. Vance?" she whispered, her heart pounding. In their living room, Mark and Jessica watched the same broadcast. "What on earth is Dad doing?" Mark scoffed, annoyed at the interruption to his game. "He's probably confused. Oh God, this is so embarrassing." Then, the young man on the ledge spoke, his voice a choked whisper. "I lost my job. My wife left me. I have nothing." "I know," Arthur said softly, and the young man knew somehow that he did. Slowly, Arthur took a step forward. "It's a long walk home," he said again. "But you don't have to walk it alone." He extended a hand. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. After a moment that stretched for an eternity, the young man on the ledge took it. As Arthur helped the trembling man back over the railing to safety, the news broadcast cut away from the live feed. The image was replaced by the face of a famous news anchor, a man known for his gravitas and impeccable sources. His expression was one of profound seriousness and awe. "We interrupt this program with a developing story," the anchor began, his voice resonating with importance. "The man you just saw perform an incredible act of bravery on the Jefferson Bridge is not, as it might appear, simply a courageous citizen. We have just received confirmation from the highest levels of the Department of Defense. His name is Arthur Vance, and for 30 years he was a ghost, a legend in the intelligence community known only by the codename Kane." Mark and Jessica stared at the screen, a forkful of takeout food halfway to Jessica's mouth. Mark let out a short, confused laugh. "Kane? What is this, a movie?" But the anchor was not joking. His face was deadly serious. "What we are about to share has been declassified by executive order within the last 5 minutes. Arthur Vance was the founder and, for most of its existence, the sole operative of the legendary St. Jude's Compact, a deep-cover unit tasked with executing the most sensitive and dangerous rescue operations in the world. The reveal had begun, and in their living room, two people's entire world was about to shatter. The news anchor's voice was a steady, reverent drumbeat, each word a revelation that dismantled the reality Mark and Jessica had built around their father. The image on the screen behind the anchor changed from the newsroom logo to a grainy, black-and-white photograph. It showed a much younger Arthur, his face hard and lean, his eyes possessing an intensity that was almost frightening. He was in combat gear, surrounded by smoke and rubble. On the screen, text began to appear, a simple, stark list that grew with each of the anchor's pronouncements. Rank, classified. Unit, St. Jude's Compact. Codename, Kane. Commendations, all classified. For 3 decades, the anchor continued, his voice resonating with the weight of history. Kane was a name whispered in the halls of the Pentagon and the CIA. He was a myth, a ghost story they told new recruits. He was the man they sent when all other options had failed. He specialized in what they called impossible rescues in non-permissive environments. That's a polite way of saying he walked into hell alone and brought people back. Mark's mouth was hanging open. The remote control slipped from his limp fingers and clattered onto the floor. Jessica was frozen, her eyes wide with a dawning horror that was not about the danger her father-in-law had faced, but about the profound, monumental ignorance with which she had treated him. The anchor began to list a few of the newly declassified operations, missions that had been legendary but officially unattributed for decades. In 1988, it was Kane who infiltrated a fortified compound in the Andean highlands to rescue a team of kidnapped DEA agents, an operation that was publicly credited to a foreign intelligence agency. In 1995, during the Balkan conflict, he single-handedly extracted the family of a key political dissident from a besieged city, guiding them for 3 days through enemy territory. The official story was that they had escaped on their own. A new image appeared on the screen, a computer-generated map showing a route snaking through mountains and war-torn cities. He was responsible for the rescue of the crew of a downed spy plane from inside North Korea, the extraction of a group of seismologists taken hostage by a warlord in Central Africa, and, in his final operation before his official death 10 years ago, he walked into the private prison of a brutal dictator and walked out with the man's 8-year-old daughter, who had been held to ensure her father's political compliance. The screen now showed a child's drawing of a raven holding a key, sketched in crayon. The anchor's voice softened. The girl gave him this drawing. It became the symbol of his unit. He was the patron saint of lost causes, the man you prayed for when you had no hope left. He refused every medal, every public acknowledgement. He served his country in the deepest shadows, asking for nothing in return. When he retired, the government staged his death to protect him and his family from the countless enemies he had made. He was given a new identity, or rather, he was allowed to return to his real one, Arthur Vance. A quiet man living a quiet life in a small apartment. The camera in the newsroom zoomed in on the anchor's face. He looked directly into the lens, his expression one of profound respect. The man on the bridge today was not just a hero for a moment. He has been a hero his entire life. We have just been privileged enough to finally see it. The special report ended. The broadcast cut back to the live feed from the Jefferson Bridge. The scene was different now. The chaos had been replaced by a quiet, reverent order. The young man Arthur had saved was being gently led to an ambulance. But Arthur was not being interviewed by reporters. He was not being clapped on the back by the police. Instead, he was standing beside a nondescript black sedan that had appeared out of nowhere. 2 men in dark, impeccably tailored suits stood with him. They weren't flanking him like guards. They were standing near him with an air of profound deference, as if in the presence of royalty. One of them was holding Arthur's old wool coat for him. As Arthur shrugged it on, the news camera zoomed in, and for a heart-stopping moment, it caught a detail that no one had ever been meant to see. A fresh gust of wind blew Arthur's shirt cuff back, and there, on his weathered forearm, was the faded sea-green ink of a raven holding a skeletal key. The totem. The proof. The legend made real. Mark made a choking sound, a mix of a sob and a gasp. Jessica's face was chalk-white. The words she had typed just a few hours ago, the cruel, dismissive joke, echoed in her mind. Stay in the hospital for another month. It's so nice and quiet without you. LOL. She felt a wave of nausea so powerful she had to grip the edge of the sofa. They hadn't just been unkind. They hadn't just been ungrateful. They had been fools. They had been living in the same city as a living legend, a true American hero, and they had told him to call a taxi because they were watching TV. The full, crushing weight of their disrespect, their ignorance, their monumental failure as a son and a daughter, came crashing down on them in the silent, horrified space of their perfect, empty home. The news broadcast moved on to other stories, politics, sports, the weather, but Mark and Jessica heard none of it. The television was just a box making meaningless noise in the corner of a room that had suddenly become a courtroom, where they stood as the accused, the prosecutors, and the judges. The silence that filled the space between them was immense, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from 30 years of their own ignorance and a single afternoon of profound shame. It was Mark who finally broke it. He scrambled for the remote, his movements clumsy and frantic, and silenced the television. The sudden absence of sound was even more deafening. He looked at the dark screen, his own shocked, pale face reflected back at him. He saw a stranger, a man who didn't know his own father. He had built his identity on his career, his house, his possessions, a fragile scaffold of success. And in a 10-minute news report, it had all been demolished, revealing the hollow, rotten core of his character. He thought of all the times he had been annoyed by his father, the slow way he told stories, the way he would just sit and read for hours, his refusal to buy new things, his quiet, unassuming nature. Mark had seen it all as weakness, as a failure to adapt, a sign that the old man was losing his grip. Now he saw it for what it was, the camouflage of a lion who had chosen to live among sheep. The quiet was discipline. The simplicity was a choice. The silence was a vault holding secrets that would have crushed a lesser man. Jessica began to cry, not loud, dramatic sobs, but a quiet, hopeless weeping. The tears tracked through her expensive makeup, leaving black streaks on her cheeks. She was mourning the loss of something she never knew she had, the respect of a great man. She remembered every condescending remark, every side complaint about having to visit him, every casual dismissal of his opinions. She had treated him like a piece of old, unwanted furniture, a relic from her husband's past that she was forced to accommodate. She had judged him by his threadbare coat, not by the measure of his soul. "Mark," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What have we done?" Mark didn't answer. He was staring at his smartphone, which lay on the coffee table. The screen was dark, but he could see the reflection of his own trembling hand reaching for it. He unlocked it, his thumb shaking so badly it took him 3 tries. He opened the family chat. There they were, the words. His own casual cruelty, followed by his wife's laughing reinforcement. "Call a taxi. I'm watching TV. Stay in the hospital for another month. It's so nice without you. LOL. It was evidence of a crime he hadn't known he was committing. The crime of dishonoring a man who was the very definition of honor. His finger hovered over the call button next to Dad. What could he possibly say? "Sorry I told you to get a cab. Dad, I didn't realize you were a secret national hero. My mistake for treating you like garbage my entire adult life. I just found out you saved the world a few times." No words could bridge the chasm that had just opened up between them. But he had to do something. He had to try. He pressed the button. The phone began to ring, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. 1 ring, 2 rings. Each one was a hammer blow against his own guilt. 3 rings. He imagined his father, sitting in that quiet government car, hearing the phone, seeing his son's name on the screen. 4 rings. Would he answer? Did he even have his old, cheap phone with him? Or had one of the men in suits given him a new, encrypted one? The thought was absurd, but his entire world had become absurd. 5 rings. Voicemail. Hi, you've reached Arthur. Please leave a message. The familiar, quiet voice was a fresh stab of guilt. Mark hung up, his heart pounding. He immediately hit redial. The ringing started again. 1 ring. 2. 3. I'm such an idiot, he muttered, running his hands through his hair. A complete and utter idiot. Jessica was watching him, her face a mess of tears and mascara. Call him again, she urged, as if the sheer volume of calls could somehow atone for the quality of their character. So he did. He called again, and again, and again. The action became a frantic, desperate penance. Each unanswered call was a confirmation of his failure. The narration of his life was being rewritten in real time. He wasn't the successful son of a simple, retired old man. He was the shamefully ignorant child of a giant. He called 10 times, 20, 30. The number on the screen became a testament to his desperation. The hero on the bridge had been calm, patient, and resolute. The son in the living room was a panicked, flailing mess, hitting a button over and over again, hoping to undo a lifetime of casual neglect with a flurry of digital appeals. The 67 calls mentioned in the story's title weren't just phone calls. They were 67 unanswered prayers for a forgiveness he hadn't even begun to earn. And on the other side of the city, a quiet man was finally on his way home, leaving the noise and the chaos behind him. The black sedan moved through the city streets with an unhurried, silent grace. It was an island of calm in the turbulent river of traffic. Inside, the world was muted, the sounds of the city a distant, muffled roar. Arthur sat in the back seat, his head leaning against the cool leather. He wasn't looking out the window at the city that was now buzzing with his name. His eyes were closed. He was not basking in the glow of his newfound fame. He was simply tired. The surgery, the emotional blow from his family, the adrenaline of the crisis on the bridge. It had all taken a toll. He felt a weariness that went bone deep. The man in the passenger seat, one of the two who had materialized at his side, turned slightly. We've taken the liberty of disabling your personal phone, sir, he said, his voice respectful and discreet. We can assume it's active. We have a secure replacement for you. He gestured to a sleek, anonymous-looking device resting on the seat beside Arthur. Arthur opened his eyes and looked at the new phone. He then glanced at his own worn coat, where his old, cracked phone was nestled in the inner pocket, buzzing silently, lighting up with the name Mark over and over again. He had felt the vibrations, a frantic, desperate pulse against his chest. He knew what it was. He knew what it meant. He knew that they knew. He didn't feel a sense of triumph. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt a profound, bottomless sadness. He had never wanted this. The anonymity, the quiet life, it hadn't just been for his protection. It had been his reward. It was the peace he had earned after a lifetime of war in the shadows. He had wanted to be a father, not a monument. He had wanted the love of his son, not his awe. But he had failed to secure the one thing that mattered most. The car pulled up to his modest apartment building. It looked out of place, a sleek black shark in a sea of minnows. The driver, the second man in a suit, got out and opened the door for him. We'll have a team here within the hour to secure the building, Mr. Vance, the first man said. And a detail will be assigned to you until we can assess any potential new threats. Arthur shook his head. No, he said, his voice raspy with fatigue. No teams, no details. I just want to go home. The man looked like he was about to argue, to quote protocol and procedure, but he looked into Arthur's eyes and saw the same unshakable authority the detective on the bridge had seen. He simply nodded. As you wish, sir. We'll be discreet. Arthur got out of the car. He didn't take the new phone. He walked toward the entrance of his building, the familiar chipped concrete steps a welcome sight. He was home. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs, each step an effort. He unlocked his apartment door and stepped inside. Nothing had changed. It was his sanctuary, quiet, still, filled with the scent of old books and coffee. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He shrugged off his coat and let it fall onto a chair. He walked to his worn leather armchair and sank into it, the old springs groaning in welcome. He was a king returning to his humble castle. He finally pulled the old smartphone from his pocket. The screen lit up with the notifications. 67 missed calls from Mark. 23 text messages. He opened the first one. Dad, I saw the news. Call me. The next one. Dad, I am so sorry. Please call me. The next. Dad, I don't know what to say. I'm a fool. Please, I need to talk to you. He read a few more, each one a frantic, desperate plea. They were the words he had longed to hear, in some form, for years. Words of connection, of need. But they were coming too late and for the wrong reasons. They weren't calling because they missed their father. They were calling because they had discovered he was someone important. Their respect wasn't for him, the man who had raised them, but for Cain, the hero on their television screen. And that was a line he couldn't uncross. With a quiet, final gesture, he held down the power button on the side of the phone. The screen prompted him. Power off? He pressed it. The screen went black. The frantic buzzing ceased. Silence. The only sound in the room was the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the steady, rhythmic beat of his own mended heart. He had been vindicated in the eyes of the world, but the resolution he sought was not in their applause or his family's sudden, panicked contrition. It was here, in the quiet solitude of his own home, in the peace he had fought so hard, in so many unseen ways to secure. His honor had been restored, but he had known it was there all along. The true lesson was not for him, but for those who had been blind to it. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, the quiet hero sat alone in his chair, finally, truly at peace. We live in a world that is quick to judge, a world that often measures a person's worth by their possessions, their title, or their online presence. But the greatest heroes, the souls with the truest strength, often walk among us in silence, wearing the humble camouflage of an ordinary life. They ask for nothing, and they often receive nothing in return. The story of Arthur Vance reminds us that behind every pair of eyes is a story we cannot possibly know. So we ask you this. When was the last time you underestimated someone? When was the last time you dismissed someone based on their appearance, their age, or their quiet demeanor? Tell us your story in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of these hidden heroes and want to hear more stories that inspire us to look deeper and act with more kindness, please subscribe to our channel and become part of a community that values honor above all else.